China's development has amazed the world during 40 years of reform and opening up. But questions remain whether China's road is unique or replicable. How Chinese is China today? And is it a follower or leader in world technology? China is connecting with the world through its Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to be more inclusive and build a shared future. Is this ambitious plan seen as an opportunity or a threat by other countries? What should be made of debt trap allegations? Will foreign investment get more access to the Chinese market? For more discussion, tune in for Dialogue's special programs.
With reform and opening up, China has created unprecedented economic progress. At the same time, China's international relations have become more diversified and sophisticated. And of course, there have been sacrifices and trade-offs along the way. How can we evaluate and draw lessons from the 40 years of China's re-engagement with the world? Is there such a thing as China's road? If so, what is it? And where will it lead us? To explore the remarkable story of China's recent past, today I'm happy to be joined here by Rick Dunham, visiting scholar from Tsinghua University, Charles Liu, founder of How Capital, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, and Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. This is a dialogue for the year-end special. I'm Yang Rui. In the course of China's development, China has enjoyed the sweet fruits of success, but also paid the price of rapid growth. China has learned from the advanced experience of foreign countries, but also contributed enormously China's wisdom to global governance. As China moves closer to the center of the world stage, it has developed closer yet more complicated ties with the rest of the world. So the question arises, is China still Chinese today? To what extent has China become more internationalized while connecting and integrating with the outside world? And how much has China been able to retain its unique characteristics and remain Chinese? Each of you will have 1 minute to state your position and present your argument.
When I first arrived in China to work here in 2014, there was a lot that reminded me of my birthplace, Kenya, and a lot that reminded me of where I used to live as well, the UK. There was a lot that was Chinese, the language, of course, that's very different. But the way that the Chinese economy has moved is what other countries are experiencing as well. Globalization is moving countries, it is changing them, and although over time, China itself, even just over the 4.5 years that I've been here, the country has changed in ways which will not be able to be reversed. But at the same time, those things are not only unique, there's also a lot which is from other countries and from a range of different countries too.
Maybe Beijing is a unique place for being cosmopolitan one. Charles, do you think China has fast become beyond recognition?
I started doing business in China in the 1980s, so it's 40 years. And the transformation has been phenomenal. But I don't think it's a question of whether or not China is still Chinese. The whole world has changed. 40 years ago, you had basically the walled rose gardens of the US and Europe. Today, the rest of the world is rising. 40 years ago, the GDP of China was $1 more than India. Today, it's 500% per capita GDP. 40 years ago, the literacy rate in China was less than 20%. Today is over 90%. But it's the same thing that's happening all over the world. So I think it's not a question of whether or not China is still Chinese, because you can't really define Chinese. Now the biggest story of China today all over the world is high-speed rail, mobile payment. Are these things Chinese? 10 years ago, they weren't, but today they are. So I think it's a question of globalization transforming the world, and every country's DNA has changed fundamentally.
Well, perhaps the question should have been asked, will China be still Chinese? Or in other words, will China be part of the whole world? Victor, what's your position?
I think over the past 40 years, China has transformed profoundly and completely. No one probably 40 years ago could have predicted how much its transformation could be. Therefore, China today is very different from China 40 years ago. However, I think at the core, the Chinese will remain the Chinese, and it is very different from many other cultures or civilizations in the rest of the world. There is, of course, convergence. There are many things to be shared by many other communities in the world. But I think at the core, for example, Confucianism, or the Chinese version of Buddhism, for example, and the Chinese culture, the family value, for example, still remain very predominantly Chinese. And I believe it will remain so for many years going forward. However, it doesn't mean that the Chinese characteristics, for example, are unique to the Chinese. They can be shared by many other cultures, and the world eventually will become a convergent story. More and more things will be common. But I believe 1,000 years from today, the Chinese will still be very much Chinese.
Rick, President Xi Jinping said in his policy speech commemorating the 40th anniversary of China's opening up, China hates to be lectured, and there are always things that will never ever be changed fundamentally. Was he talking about political principles or the cultural DNA of China?
President Xi Jinping, when he was talking both politics and culture. I mean, just like Donald Trump talks about American exceptionalism, I think Xi Jinping believes in the exceptionalism of Chinese culture. Now, when you ask, is China still Chinese, I think the answer is clearly yes. Whether you call the economic system socialism with Chinese characteristics or capitalism with Chinese characteristics, what's common is Chinese characteristics. And I think that the world has become more interdependent as the global economy has grown and China has become more part of it. I think that you have, China cannot escape if there are trends in the global economy, a downturn, because it is much more integrated. At the same time, China, I don't think, has fundamentally changed as a nation. I mean, meaning the people, the character of the nation, I think, is still fundamentally the same, even though there has been remarkable change, economic growth, and literacy growth.
Now let's dive into a more focused area, high technology. From big data to artificial intelligence, there is no doubt that these high-tech industries are changing the world. But questions such as whether they are a blessing or a curse remain to be answered. And how does China position itself in the high-tech development race? Is China a follower or a leader? Hannah.
Well, in many ways, China is a leader. But what has been able to be done in this country is very, very successful infant industry protection. Now, back in the 60s and the 1970s, this was something which many countries, and especially developing countries, were trying to adopt. Even special economic zones were a form and associated with that, which is one of the most successful aspects of China's economic growth. At the same time, because China is so big, then this has posed a problem with regards to other countries.
In short, will China be a leader or a follower in digital technology?
Oh, certainly a leader because of the scale that's possible here.
Anyone who disagrees?
I mean, I think China at this point is, if you're forcing us into one or the other, is more a follower than a leader, but it's emerging as a leader. I mean, the technology over the past 20 years, China has followed in development of technology, but I think because of the scale that Hannah talked about and because of the government prioritization of high technology, China will emerge as a leader in the next 10 years. I think it's a change that's happened, but I really would think that it's fair to say that China has followed more, has borrowed more technology over in the past. We're looking ahead, though.
Not quite. I would disagree, because I think in a number of sectors, the application of technology, maybe not the theoretical basis of the technology, China has been a follower on the theoretical basis of technology, but has been a leader in the application of certain technology. For example, in e-commerce, no one has what China has developed. Mobile payments, no one has what China has developed.
Well, they don't have the scale. But let me remind you that in Kenya, for example, we had M-Pesa in 2007 starting off. These are mobile payments through SMS. Well developed. And it's also a model which many other countries are using. And at the same time, China was also developing WeChat. Tencent was developing WeChat and has now suddenly become so huge.
The difference there is there's serious, new, brand new, most modern, most sophisticated infrastructure in China that doesn't exist in Africa, and also doesn't exist in fact in the United States.
But I'm afraid in most cases we have this inevitable obstacle of a bottleneck. From a 0 to 1, that means fundamental innovation and the very issue of creation of new technology. China was almost none, 0 for most of the time when we discuss the issue of digital technology. But from 1 to 99 or 100, we are easy to follow. We could easily catch up and touch base. So what do you think of this issue that makes a sea difference, Victor? Therefore, we'll be a follower instead of a leader.
I think China is right now both a follower and a leader. And also it depends on which sector you are talking about. I think if we talk about 5G, China is a leader. And I actually do not buy the story that the Western countries, especially the United States, are very much concerned about security arrangements by Huawei equipment. If they are concerned about Huawei, they should have equal concerns about Nokia or Motorola or Ericsson. It's the same thing, basically. With the same equipment, you can do good things with it, or you can do bad things with it. So you need to come up with the same standard. So if the United States or Western countries say, we have a standard, and Huawei and other equipment suppliers need to live up to that standard, and you cannot deviate from the standard, fine, come up with a standard. I think eventually the United States' concern is that they are very much worried about the extent and the scale of Huawei, and they are concerned about maybe Huawei may dominate in the 5G sector going forward. And either they are worried about Huawei doing stupid things with their equipment, or, for example, if they need to use the Huawei equipment to do all kinds of surveillance against the targets of their own choice, then they need to inform Huawei. So I think they are caught in a dilemma right now. However, I think, given the scale of Huawei, given the number of intellectual property rights in the 5G sector that Huawei possesses, I think, given 3 years or 5 years' time, Huawei will definitely break out of the crowd and take a leadership role. Very, very definitely. And
the protection of national security is one thing. I'm afraid the protection of one's privacy is a different story. Therefore, there are good reasons for the West to trail behind China, which seems to pay less attention to the protection of individual privacy.
If you talk about Chinese culture, it's pragmatism. It's pragmatic. I don't care if Pony Ma knows where I am, because WeChat brings a lot of efficiencies to my life. I don't care if there are CCTV cameras, 400 million in China, as long as I don't do anything bad and it catches bad people. Pragmatism means principles are not carried to the extreme. The principle of personal privacy is not carried to the extreme, where I have some German friends who live in Beijing refuse to put WeChat on their phones. Well, that's a violation of my personal principle. Pragmatism versus extreme principles.
Of course, there is pragmatism, and I think everywhere we see people being pragmatic. However, is there really much choice at the moment? If there was another provider like Tencent for WeChat, who had encrypted messaging, who had just the same kind of social media efficiency, but still provided privacy, then would Chinese people migrate to that? Potentially they would, but we don't know. So we have to wait and see. We have to see whether this will be something which comes up in the future, potentially.
So the protection of privacy will serve as a major obstacle that prevents China from somehow assuming leadership in the area of software, because showing respect for one's privacy will, of course, be first and foremost prioritized on the agenda of the Western governments. What do you think of, say, his mention of the issue of pragmatism?
We have to divide this between the economic and the personal feelings of people. I mean, I think in the United States, probably in Europe, there's a great sense of wanting to feel personal privacy, wanting not to have big data used by governments or corporations in ways that they feel are invasive. At the same time, the economic system, I think whether it's driven in China or especially if you look at Facebook, Google, some of the big data companies based in the US, has been driven by profit. I mean, the allegations of Facebook violating the rights, the privacy rights of individuals is getting to be scary more and more, including in the last few weeks, the reports that they would allow certain advertisers to delete messages, private messages, in people's accounts, shocked a lot of people in the United States. So I think that what you have in both worlds is that you have the technology is driven by profit, and governments have great ability, and the companies, to invade your privacy. The question is, will they do it? And the questions are, should there be any limits within the nations, or globally, should there be rules that would limit how much either corporations could do it or governments could interfere?
Here is eventually the issue of how to define leadership. Now, do you think leadership is very much driven by moral superiority, ethic code in shaping our behavior in the prospective world? Or do you think it's the mere issue of a digital technology itself in terms of hardware and the application to create more convenience in the age of consumerism?
There's no question that it is the hard stuff, the hardware, the software, and the applications and the use that enhances efficiency in a daily life that will make the difference. I don't think...
But will the leadership be easily accepted by the rest of the world if you simply...
I don't think you can talk about it as the rest of the world, because Alipay, for example, and WeChat Pay is now prevalent throughout Southeast Asia for very pragmatic reasons. Because of Chinese tourists travel there, it's now very, very much an Asian phenomenon. And also, even in the Parisian shops, before the Yellow Jackets took over, they all accepted Alipay and WeChat Pay. It's very pragmatic. It's very real, enhances efficiency, makes your life easier, makes your purchases easier, and that's what mattered. And that's leadership. But you can call it leadership, but you don't really have to call it leadership because the prevalence of use.
Do you agree or disagree?
I have my own opinion on this one. You asked about privacy. First of all, privacy in an ideal world, if anyone can have a choice, he probably would choose maximum privacy. But privacy itself is always relative, and it keeps changing.
In what context will it be relative?
Relative. For example, privacy, taking a photo of me without my permission can be part of my privacy. However, if I'm in a public place, I lose my privacy. Everyone can take a picture of me without my consent, for example. And also, it changes from one jurisdiction to another, changes from one culture to another. So you cannot have a dictated privacy. It keeps changing from time to time, from place to place, and even for one particular person, it keeps according to different situations. That's number one. Now, if any country or any company wants to be a leader of privacy, that's not a technological choice. That's a political choice. And that's a choice which is doomed to failure because you cannot really be a leader of privacy. I think the relationship between privacy and technology is a very interesting thing.
But I'm afraid that there are different kinds of leadership. There is one which is based on fears of individuals. The other, I'm afraid, is based on the freedom of making choice. Here is the definition about how to look at the leadership. Will it be based on fears, guarantee 100% law and order, stability, so on and so forth, or you should do more to respect freedom of making choice?
Let me introduce one more word into our discussion, localization. I think if China does want to be a digital leader, what matters is understanding the specific cultures and practices in the different countries that Chinese companies and operators go to. Now, WeChat, you just mentioned, successful in South Asia, not successful in South Africa, even though 32% of that company is owned by South Africans, but through Tencent. So it has not been so successful, although successful within the Chinese community in South Africa, and that is across the board in most African countries. So at the same time, there is another Chinese company who has been very, very successful digitally and is actually even buying up locally produced content and so on in order to become even more successful. That company is called Tencent, and they sell they sell lots of different lots of types of mobile phone handsets, and they at a very low cost. And they've been very successful because they've understood this is what African people in, and also localized between the different African markets that they're in. If China does want to be a digital leader, these are going to be the kinds of issues which will come up. And so in order for success in the US, for example, Chinese companies have to adapt to what happens there.
And one thing that may prevent China from assuming leadership is the likelihood that from 2019 onward, we're going to have more unemployment because of the use of artificial intelligence, robots. And so what will happen to university graduates in their millions? Each year we have to fix jobs of up to 8 million,
8 million, yes.
Jobs, to say nothing who are waiting for jobs on the list in the job market.
This revolution that we are in the midst of is going to affect China, and I think this should be one of the top priorities of government policy making, because the Industrial Revolution replaced manual labor with machines. The artificial intelligence revolution is going to replace repetitive mental behavior with machines. And so it's going to replace people who are more educated. And what everyone in every government in the world, but particularly in China, has to think about is, what jobs do we have for these people who are educated, college educated, who are entering a marketplace where there are fewer of these people needed. Also, this is the downside of China having such a rapid increase in education and literacy. There are more educated people coming into the workforce. And so I think it has to be a high priority to figure out whether it's entrepreneurialism or other kinds of business for these intelligent people. I think you can't just think that artificial intelligence is a good thing for society. It's a good thing for the world. It will add very much to our quality of life, but it will displace people, much as the manufacturing revolution displaced the old workers in Great Britain for America.
The last question before we conclude this chapter of whether China is a leader or a follower in assuming digital technology is the middle income trap. Now, it seems one important concept concerning whether China will survive the middle income trap is the Lewis turning point, whether we have exhausted the labor dividends. We have a sizable population of 1.3 billion, and India is quickly catching up. However, we still maintain dynamic rapid growth. What do you think will be the alternative truth or solution to the use of labor dividends to foster China's growth or to sustain our expansion, Victor?
I think if you really look at the realities in China, China still has many areas of growth and potential for growth. For example, if you look at the healthcare sector, the pharmaceutical sector, and if you look at geographically, for example, the middle part of China and the western part of China, or even, for example, in Beijing, if you leave the city of Beijing and go any direction by 50 kilometers, you actually see lots of areas where development is very unsatisfactory.
You are being very philosophical, Victor. Sorry,
which we can.
I'm sorry, you are being very philosophical. Just give me a short answer as to whether China will survive the middle income trap with the help of digital technology. Otherwise, you won't be able to assume the leadership, given the massive unemployment rate.
First of all, the middle income trap itself is a little
Debatable.
misleading.
Yeah.
Why? Because it applied to certain countries, especially in Latin American countries, and they fail to grow because of many other reasons, not purely because of the middle income trap. That's number one. Number two is that if you look at China, I still believe there are so many areas of growth, and we can keep growing for many years, if not many decades to come. And that gives me hope that in terms of the size of the GDP, in terms of the per capita GDP, for example, we need to grow and grow.
Very quickly,
and
from
we
each
need
of
to
you,
catch up.
the rest, three of you, your answer to the middle income trap, I mean in the area of digital technology.
I think the middle income trap, as described by countries like, or as seen by countries like Brazil and Argentina, like you said, in South America, is based on totally different set of scenarios. China itself is a huge market, and what you have for digitalization is really an enhancement of efficiency, which can be applied to every sector. Not only that, urbanization process has just really begun in China. There's still, as Victor said, many sectors which are, look at what happened in 5 years. China went from nothing to become the largest manufacturer of solar panels in the world. So you now have new renewable sources of energy. You have the ecological repair of the Three Gorges area. All of these have now become industrial sectors, which didn't exist before. Yeah. And China will lead.
And
Very
there's a big margin for the development of the service industry.
I think I agree, services industry especially. Yes. And the biggest issue, let's forget middle income trap. The issue is more how to make sure that the Chinese society remains one which is more equal, and that there's not certain people that rise above and the people at the bottom, the ones who are left out. That is going to be the biggest issue. That is also a UN agenda. It's global. How not to leave people behind. This is going to be key.
And I'll add another factor, consumer confidence, people buying things. I mean, I would redefine the middle income trap, but the idea of if middle income people in China buy goods and services, the service economy, then it creates jobs, and it can be a virtuous circle to help build up and expand job openings, particularly for people who are educated. So I think that encouraging consumerism, and I don't mean wild spending for luxury goods, but a more consumer economy can create a lot of good jobs. And so I think that's something, the shift in government priorities from manufacturing to more consumer orientation.
Yes, indeed, an ongoing quiet shift from labor-intensive manufacturing dominance to more digital technology-intensive or capital-intensive growth drives the expansion of the Chinese economy. Having said this, whether China is able to assume the leadership largely depends on how we look at ourselves, whether we would avoid making critically serious mistakes in the journey of rediscovery, despite the blow and appeal of 5G leadership initially. I'll see you in the next chapter. Stay with us.